Throughout history, the types of government present in different parts of the world were replaced countless times. This process was either enforced from outside by conquest or emerged from within through evolution. While government holds no monopoly on power, it controls the legal system, has a major influence on a nation's monetary administration, and is in command of the state's armed forces. The role of government is to write, execute, and interpret law. Law can be defined as a system of rules and guidelines which are enforced through societal institutions to govern behavior. Law is not to be mistaken with morality. While morals are a part of human psychology that reflect the values of a society and differentiate good from bad behavior, law exists as a set of defined rules enforced through institutional constructs and are supposed to ensure social stability and to prevent socially disruptive behavior. Any individual or cooperative behavior threatening a person's ability to strive for the fulfillment of its needs and therefore compromising its quality of life could be considered socially disruptive. A law is usually put in place to minimize the occurrence of pre-existing socially disruptive behavior. To inhibit such behavior, which is labeled a crime upon the enactment of the law, individuals who participate in it undergo punishment, which is supposed to act as deterrence for the population. While socially disruptive behavior and crime are closely related, they do not fully coincide. Not all crimes as defined by law are socially disruptive. Neither is every socially disruptive behavior considered a crime. An individual that accumulates great wealth in an environment in which many others struggle to survive has direct negative effects on their quality of life. Not only does the concentration of wealth prevent others to obtain the means which they need to thrive, simply the presence of relative wealth has dire consequences on the health of poor individuals and the structural integrity of society. This corrupt and highly socially disruptive behavior of hoarding capital is, however, not considered a crime despite its destructive effects on the population's quality of life. Socially disruptive behavior is rooted in the shortcomings of societal institutions. In some cases, people engage in such behavior due to an understanding of right and wrong which strongly deviates from the set of morals which would be most beneficial for society. As mentioned earlier, human values which lie at the basis of morality and therefore behavior are shaped and reinforced by society's institutional structures. Therefore, individuals of any given society may only engage in behavior that is beneficial for other individuals and the totality of society if its surroundings uphold a value system that advocates such behavior. The behavioral patterns with the most socially disruptive tendencies imply some form of violence. Regarding violent behavior, it is important to understand that in most cases, such behavior originates from pre-existing violence. Violent behavior may of course be a direct response to violence. However, the origin of violence may also date back to childhood experiences in which the individual may have been subject to physical or mental abuse. A form of violence which causes far more death and suffering than behavioral violence is structural violence. James Gilligan defines structural violence as the increased rates of death and disability suffered by those who occupy the bottom rungs of society as contrasted with the relatively lower death rates experienced by those who are above them. Köhler and Alcock stated, "Whenever persons are harmed, maimed or killed by poverty and unjust social, political and economic institutions, systems or structures, we speak of structural violence. In other words, structural violence is harm caused by social structures which prevent people from satisfying their basic needs. Structural violence directly impacts the well-being and the survivability of the population on two different levels. Firstly, through the limitation of access to vital goods and services. For instance, roughly 1 billion people suffer from undernutrition, while global food production could easily feed every human being on the planet. The World Health Organization stated in 2005 that 11 million children under the age of 5 die from preventable diseases annually. Secondly, structural violence does harm through the influence of stress experienced from relative poverty on physiological and mental health. This correlation of relative poverty and overall health is known as the health socio-economic gradient. It describes the global phenomenon of increased rates of physiological and mental diseases the further one descends in the socio-economic spectrum. A study conducted on the correlation between socio-economic status and the world's leading cause of death, coronary heart disease, found that the longer a person remains in relative poverty, the more likely he or she is to develop this condition. Relative poverty may affect an individual's mental health in a rather abstract way. A single mother working several jobs in order to finance the fulfillment of her family's needs is forced to limit her personal availability for the child. On top of the lacking support and guidance, the child may experience frustration given abuse. Due to depressions and anxiety the mother might develop because of the ongoing financial stress. As a result of its upbringing, the child is likely to develop depression, addiction, and violent tendencies. While one might argue that it was the mother's fault for not properly caring for her child, the fundamental cause for this unhealthy development lay undoubtedly in the mother's economic circumstances. By stating, "Poverty is the worst form of violence," Mahatma Gandhi accurately described the effects of structural violence. This becomes more evident when comparing the most fatal acts of organized behavioral violence in history with the effects of structural violence. A study conducted in 1965 estimated the number of annual deaths caused by structural violence around 18 million. Due to the increase of discrepancies between rich and poor nations in the last decades and the exponential population growth in developing countries, the death toll is likely to have increased dramatically. Comparing this number with the 10 million that died on average annually in World War II, it becomes clear that no form of violence in the history of mankind compares to the tremendous death and suffering caused by structural violence today. Additionally, structural violence poses as the main contributor to behavioral violence through life-bound limitation and the induction of humiliation and shame in poor individuals. When comparing national homicide rates with a country's income inequality, it becomes clear that relative poverty has massive influence on the level of individual socially disruptive behavior. When individual socially disruptive behavior is caused by structural violence, it is clearly the shortcomings of the social structures which fail to provide an adequate environment for the individual that are to blame for the occurrence of such behavior. Considering that socially disruptive behavior is either the result of a value system disorder or of pre-existing violence, mainly of structural nature, it becomes evident that it has its roots in the social structures of the individual's surroundings. This means that law exists to oppose the behavior generated by the shortcomings of society. Law could be considered as shoring of a society which would collapse without due to its structural flaws. The role of government, therefore, is to compensate the inefficiency of the economy. Instead of viewing socially disruptive behavior as individual guilt, it should be considered as an indicator for flaws in the social structures. The main governmental response to major crime is punishing the criminal through imprisonment. Three potential effects of this treatment are usually considered as its justification: deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. To protect the population from dangerous individuals, criminals are put behind high walls to keep them from harming anyone but themselves. While such measure seems sensible at first, it doesn't deal with the actual danger the community is exposed to in the slightest. The real threat lies in the tendency of our social structures to induce such socially disruptive and often violent behavior. Locking up identified criminals does not protect the population from a violent society generating violent individuals. While the quality of prison systems varies greatly between nations, the overall efficiency of imprisonment to rehabilitate individuals is very poor. The social structure within most prisons subjugates its inmates to strict subservience and total supervision. The shame and debasement generated in such an environment, and through the social stigma of the criminal status, create an optimal precondition of inducing higher levels of violence. While even people with low tendencies for violence develop highly violent behavior under such conditions, as was famously demonstrated in the Stanford prison experiment, closing off individuals with a history of violence in such an environment provides the conditions for a perfect storm. Rehabilitation of socially disruptive individuals cannot possibly be achieved in an environment promoting and generating such high degrees of violence. Such harsh conditions often increase the violent potential of inmates, serving in fact as breeding ground for socially disruptive behavior. The efficiency of the prison system to deter individuals from committing crime has thus far not been clearly demonstrated. In fact, the high level of repeat offenders and the lack of difference in the amount of committed crime by young people below and above the age of criminal responsibility indicate that deterrence is not a valid argument to justify the prison system. In order to effectively prevent socially disruptive behavior, rather than focusing on the punishment of criminal activity, the root causes of such behavior, which lie in the structural failings of our society, need to be addressed. The first step would be the realization that socially disruptive behavior is not simply an issue of personal accountability, but rather of the structural integrity of society. It is not about punishing evil, but eradicating the source from which this so-called evil springs. Many different forms of governmental power distribution arose throughout the world's nations. Of all, surely democracy is the most progressive form of government, enabling prosperity through equal power distribution so that everybody is able to contribute to societal progress. In an ideal democratic society, the government is elected by the people and reflects the interests and values of the majority of the population. A democracy can only function if three important criteria are met. The first is the equal distribution of influence amongst the population in the election process. If any person or interest group is somehow able to manipulate government to a higher extent than their votes and voices would allow, the term democracy should no longer apply. However, in a world where power is measured by capital, and capital is unequally distributed among the population, it is quite easy to bend the law in the desired direction. Still, there exists the common assumption that somehow political equality can manifest out of the explicit economic inequality inherent to today's socio-economic paradigm. Manipulation of political institutions is happening on many more or less subtle levels. Corporate interest groups tend to maximize their influence on law in order to optimize the effect that regulatory legislation may have on their profits. Considering that of the 150 largest economic entities, 59% are corporations, it shouldn't come as a surprise that there are numerous ways in which corporate interest groups use their influence to manipulate politics. In an electoral race, it is crucial for candidates to be strongly and positively represented by the media. Not only can corporate interest groups contribute to the electoral campaign of a candidate, they can also financially manipulate the media which is supposed to represent them, if they do not own it already. Once put in place, a government can further be manipulated by corporate lobbyists, frequently disguised as economic advisors. Financial institutions may also influence government through lobbying. Furthermore, since the financial sector provides a large fraction of a nation's budget and controls the value of currency, the governmental decision-making process is highly dependent on the interest of financial power structures. Lobbying by corporate and financial interest groups varies greatly in its conspicuity. In many cases, it is done through lobbyists directly employed by the respective institutions. On a more subtle level, certain interest groups may either take on the role of a political advisor or directly take a political post. Often, individuals switch back and forth between governmental and corporate or financial positions. As a result, conflicts of interest arise, in which the regulated become the regulators. The second criterion, which must be met in a democracy, is that votes which are given by the people have a direct influence on the decision-making process. This is already jeopardized by the direct influence that corporate and financial institutions have on government, as was stated before. Furthermore, candidates have no legal obligation to meet their electoral promises. Votes are usually not collected for important decisions. Rather, people have the opportunity to cast their vote for a certain party or politician once in a while and hope that their candidate acts in their interest. Have any votes been collected for the huge bailouts of the financial sector or any war in history? Usually, the only way the population can influence the decision-making process of their government is by massive civil disobedience or even unrest. The third and most important criterion, which is the cornerstone of a democratic society, is a well-educated population. This point, however, is vastly disregarded. It is absolutely evident that a population which is to govern itself should be well informed about all factors that influence their lives. What could be more damaging for a democratic society than a population that acts counter its own self-interest? In order for a community to be able to make the right decisions in their own governance, they need to be well informed about the synergistic relationships of all aspects of their social construct. This includes, for instance, the composition of their ecosystem, the bio and psychological features of their species, the functionality and risk of the technology they utilize, and the complex interactions of the societal institutions they uphold. Neither do today's educational system and mainstream media aim to form such a general understanding in the population, nor is the striving for such knowledge of high priority in our value system. Therefore, it should be no surprise that today's average voter is generally ill-informed about the actions that would lay in his or her own interest, and is therefore ready to be exploited and used by the existing power structures. Even if these three mentioned criteria are met by a thoroughly educated population with direct, equally distributed influence on government, there is still an intrinsic flaw of the democratic paradigm which renders an optimization of the administration of human affairs impossible. The notion that this administration should be subject to opinion. No matter how well educated a population might be, the intelligent allocation of the Earth's resources to the human population and a significantly improved management of human interaction cannot be achieved by the collective of individual perception. Based on the understanding of the natural world and the goal to achieve an optimal fulfillment of human needs, a system could be established, taking into account all the synergetic factors relevant to society. However, instead of applying the scientific understanding of the circumstances necessary for the individual and humanity as a whole to prosper, humankind is governed by sentimental values, personal experience, individual appeal, and ancient traditions.